Welcome everyone, thanks for joining me. I'm DeeDee, they them pronouns, and this is another episode of DeeDee Does History, continuing along with the Irish Potato Famine series that I've been doing, again brought to you by the people through Extra History. They're an amazing channel, so if you've been enjoying these videos, definitely check out the original creator and give them a like, a subscribe if you really like it. The information will be down in the description below. At the end of this video, as I've been trying to add something, I'm going to give a little example of the potato famine in pop culture. So without any further ado, let's get on to the video itself.
July 1846. Ireland's early summer harvest is starting to come in. Reports of blight circulate, but in the east, summer has been temperate. The hunger might be over. Lightning rends the sky. Water drops like a guillotine. An unhealthy fog blankets the land, and upon seeing it, one fisherman tells a newspaper that it's the wrath of the fairies. I knew it by the signs they were coming. And perhaps he's not far off, because a tiny, malicious organism is riding the rain. The water washes fungus spores off the infected leaves, carrying it to the ground, and under the soil, the 1846 potato crop begins to decay. In January 1846, Daniel O'Connell had stood in Parliament and warned that Peel was not doing enough to fight the famine. There are 5 million people on the verge of starvation, he warned. And I'm speaking from the depth of my conviction when I say, I believe the result of neglect will be death to an enormous amount. Now, 8 months later, Peel was gone, and the government was doing even less. Hunger began pulling Ireland apart. Mothers starved until their milk gave out and their babies died. Men who had survived off food depots and public work projects found succor in neither. Orders had been given to food depots to preserve their grain until December. It didn't matter. People arrived at the depots on foot, shoeless, having not eaten in days. Depots relented and passed out cornmeal, but their reserves were getting low. Gangs of men carrying shovels marched into market towns demanding work. Food availability was not the problem. Amid the famine, bread sat in shop windows, and Irish merchants exported tons of beef, grain, and oats to England. The government refused to intervene, so, across the island, starving peasants did instead. In County Waterford, an armed militia blocked 2 barges that were transporting Irish grain for export. That done, they moved into the town, beating merchants, stealing bread, and lighting buildings afire. A unit of dragoons ordered them to disperse. When they didn't, the soldiers opened fire. 6 bodies lay in the street. Yet as Ireland reeled towards famine, in London, Sir Charles Trevelyan was retooling his relief plan to be less generous. Trevelyan was a legend in the civil service, incorruptible, pious, and hardworking. But he was also a workaholic micromanager, steeped in the Victorian belief that poverty was the sign of moral failure. To Trevelyan, the Irish problem, the fact that Ireland remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, violence, and rebellion, lay in the Irish character. They were lazy, rebellious, and took no initiative, he thought. Potato cultivation was too easy, only requiring a few months' labor a year, breeding idleness. And it was prone to failure. And when it failed, the Irish turned to government to feed them. Absent or neglectful Irish landowners shouldered little of the cost, and London feared that the Irish were becoming habitually dependent on government aid. To save Ireland, he thought, it needed modernization and agricultural reform. He dreamed of an anglicized Ireland, like the one that existed in its cities and market towns, one with English-style capitalism and a market economy, like theirs, to serve as a trade partner. He wanted to sweep out Ireland's communal village life and barter system, replacing it with a workforce that worked for wages rather than potatoes. One where they earned money to buy food. Trevelyan saw this blight not as a disaster, but a God-sent opportunity to remake Irish society. And he was determined to make the most of it, no matter how much suffering he had to inflict. Great guy. In fact, Trevelyan had studied under the economist Thomas Malthus, who argued that when a population outstripped food production, starvation and death was a natural and proper correction. When Malthus put forth the theory, he was thinking of Ireland, and Trevelyan agreed. That belief in Malthusian principles, alongside a commitment to non-intervention in the free market, would plunge Ireland deep into famine. So when Trevelyan rolled out his reformed relief plan, it was no surprise that its primary mission was not to feed the starving, but instead to protect the free market, prevent abuse, and teach economic lessons. When food depots reopened, the poor found that the cornmeal was no longer sold at cost. That, argued Trevelyan, undercut local merchants. Now it was market price. All food depots would close, except those in the West, and Trevelyan insisted that any maize purchased come from British merchants, not American ones. When the public works began again, job seekers discovered their new wages were based on performance rather than a flat daily fee, and even the highest wages couldn't feed a family. The wages themselves were supposedly funded via a tax on Irish landlords, but many landlords had little to spare. And due to multiple levels of bureaucracy meant to prevent fraud, the road crew's wages often took weeks to arrive. And finally, there would be no intervention in food prices. Laissez-faire economics would rule. High prices, Trevelyan argued, would attract food imports. But, you guessed it, they didn't.
So you see the issue with the low wages, and those are something that we face all across our capitalist society today. These things set people up for failure and set people up for problems when these kind of challenges arise. It seems so ridiculous to me that in a society that has billionaires, that anyone can have the idea that you can work a job and not maintain a living wage, or that people have to be homeless or without anything to eat. It boggles my mind that this is acceptable for so long in society.
In fact, food prices had soared higher than ever. It had been a bad year for agriculture, and not just in Ireland. Crops failed across Europe. Countries scrambled to import extra food, and Trevelyan was late to refill his cornmeal. So by the time he grudgingly started looking, there was little to be had. And in Ireland, potato and cornmeal prices doubled. At government food depots, hungry people arrived from miles away, only to find the maize unaffordable. Across the island, small farmers and landless agricultural workers were plunged into immediate destitution. They surged into market towns to beg for food at depots, and they even began entering the hated workhouses, a government poor relief program best described as a prison for the poor, where they lived while performing mindless work in exchange for 2 meals a day. And workhouses were abusive and inhumane by design, so the poor would only enter as a last resort. Yet even they were over capacity. Despite the people's desperation, landlords upped the eviction rate, calling in police and soldiers to throw families out and demolish their homes with the sledgehammer and crowbar. Tenants killed livestock in retribution, and on occasion ambushed and murdered landlords. Evicted families wandered the roads, pitching tents in ditches. Crime rates doubled. This was the season of the gunman. And it wasn't just the small tenant farmers and landless laborers showing up at the food depots. Managers reported small landowners, 10 to 15 acre men, approaching them to request aid, fine clothes hanging off their skeletal frames.
No matter what, desperation leads to desperate actions. Crimes and things like that come from these desperate situations that people are put in.
One had even walked 12 miles to an unfamiliar town rather than reveal to his neighbors that he'd gone bankrupt. Blight compounded everything. In small farms, barley rotted in the field. Usually farmers paid laborers to harvest, but they had neither money nor potatoes to offer. And as if that wasn't enough, that winter, a series of blizzards ravaged the island, snow stacking to the rooftops, entombing whole villages. Soon, the new year dawned on what would be known as Black 47. January brought a strange frenzy. Families, hollow-eyed and losing hair, stumbled to the shore to eat seaweed and oysters. They scaled 300-foot cliffs just to steal bird eggs. They could have survived off fish, but they had neither the equipment, boats, nor skill for deep water fishing. And by that time, most of the fishermen had pawned their nets for cornmeal. Armed gangs ambushed government food convoys and butchered stolen cattle to survive. By the end of January, 700,000 had turned to working on public works. These famine roads were often a waste. They
Yeah.
started nowhere and went nowhere. Malnourished work gangs broke rocks in freezing temperatures. Their shoes and coats long ago lost to the pawn shop. And they died there, in great numbers, collapsing beside the roads from exhaustion. Violence against public works managers became so pervasive that many deserted their posts, while others, laden with guilt, ended their own lives. In a famine, it's not the starvation that kills you, it's the diseases that follow.
Yeah.
Typhus, dysentery, fever, and the famine dropsy. Peasants fleeing the countryside carried them into cities, and infection ran so rampant in workhouses, the staff began to quit. Visitors and officials reported seeing villages where the want was so extreme that families lacked the energy to even bury their dead. The Irish funeral, so embodied in the culture, disappeared piece by piece. No one wanted to gather for fear of the fevers. None could
Yeah.
afford a coffin, and eventually, even individual graves were dispensed with. Dogs scavenged the burial fields. Amid that landscape of horror, one place stood out as particularly destitute. Skibbereen, in County Cork, became internationally famous for its deplorable conditions. Drought exacerbated the famine, and after a few months, the frantic scramble to survive had passed, leaving only a lethargic wait for the grave. Families crawled across their cabins, too weak to even walk, and a visiting American found himself in a surreal conversation with two young women as they casually calculated how many days they had left to live. 14, they agreed. Accounts from Skibbereen made the village internationally famous, the face of the Great Hunger, and its ghoulish tales, repeated in newspapers, inspired people around the globe to raise money for famine relief. Donations came from as far away as Australia, and in the United States, even enslaved people and Native Americans raised funds for Ireland. The international outcry finally pushed Trevelyan to act. For months, he downplayed the increasingly urgent and alarming reports from his own officers on the ground, even when they'd rebelled against his policies, selling cornmeal at cost or serving free meals at workhouses. He relented. The British government would support outdoor relief, the opening of soup kitchens and free meal distribution. But it was too little, too late. Deep famine had already affected the planting season, and the next crop would be poor. Many Irish decided they only had two options: either fight for Ireland or leave it.
So you can see where it's led into the most desperation here for the people after the third year of the famine. And so, in looking into things attached to this, I decided to take a look into what kind of links there were to the Irish potato famine in popular culture, and came across and watched a movie called Black 47. This was released in 2018. It was set in the year of 1847, the worst year of the famine, as we've seen. It's a historical drama, so it's not 100% a historical movie, but it does a really, really good job of setting the tone. It is quite a grim movie. It's definitely not one to watch with the kids, but it really does set the feeling of the desperation that overcame people in this dark, dark situation, and what they had to come through. The movie was a critical success and a real box office success in Ireland. So if you have a chance, if you're interested, if you want to see something that's a little less dry and a little more on the entertainment side, definitely check out Black 47. Also stars Hugo Weaving, so if you enjoy his work, definitely give that a look. I thank you for coming along to watching the video with me today. I'll be back next week, starting Monday with parts 4, and Tuesday will be part 5. If you have any other suggestions after that point, leave them in the comments below. As always, check out the original creators. All that information will be linked down below, and some information as well on that movie that I referenced, Black 47, so check that out. Thank you for joining me here today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.